So we're now, as if it was planned, talking about transforming the Scottish food system, looking at how IoT and other innovative technologies can be used to support change, sustainability, and growth in this sector. Chairing this session is Professor John Crawford, and I have got to get my notes, too many words again. Professor in Strategy and Technology Management at the Adam Smith Business School, University of Glasgow. A theoretical biologist, many other things, complex systems, huge successes. John, I'm going to leave it to you to chair our panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sharon. Can everybody hear okay? We didn't do a mic test, great. Okay. That last presentation was an amazing segue into this next session, because if you take all the people on the planet, I think you can fit them onto the Isle of Man. I don't know if that's true, but I think it's roughly true. But despite the fact that the built environment takes up a very small fraction of the surface of the planet, we've managed the consequences of the people and the activities in those built environments has devastated most of the rest of the surface of the Earth, and of course, impacted on the climate. And one of the biggest factors that connects urban to non-urban environments is the food system. About 30% of our climate carbon footprint is the food system. About a third of that is in fields, and then 2/3 of that is when stuff leaves the fields and gets processed and eaten and wasted. And that's what this session's about. And a lot of the ideas and concepts that were just presented previously link very nicely into this next session, because the way that, my perception in working with companies from some of the biggest companies in the world to some of SMEs, is that when they think about technology and the role of digital in their businesses, they think about how they can do what they're already doing a wee bit better or more efficiently or automated, rather than thinking about actually how it changes the whole game. And with the food system, not only will it change the whole game, but it must change the whole game, because we need a systemic change in the food system, because it is unsustainable from an environmental perspective, and it's unsustainable from a health perspective. So what we're going to talk about here really is about the big reconnection. How do we connect our urban selves to our rural selves through the food system in a way that creates synergistic solutions from a health perspective as well as from an environmental perspective? And we've collected together an amazing array of people to give their perspective on this. And we're attempting to rattle through the key points quickly so we can open up for discussion, because we want to leave plenty of time for a bit of a Q&A and a back and forth with the audience. So each speaker is going to introduce themselves and have 1.5 minutes to say a little bit about themselves, and also something surprising that maybe nobody else knows about them. And we're going to kick off with Emilie.
Excellent. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I think so. So I'm Emilie Combet. I'm a professor of human nutrition at the University of Glasgow, and I'm interested in food, diet, and how it shapes the way we age and our disease trajectories. And what I particularly liked in the last presentation was this notion of socio-technical challenge and bringing people together. Something maybe different about me. I could tell you that I've got children and I like to cook, but I also made my own wedding dress, random fact. And I think it shows that each of us are connected to what we do. So for me, it's food and nutrition, but we bring a lot of different skills, and food touches all types of sectors, all types of discipline, and to really transform the food system, we need to come together and really share, exchange, and think how we can evaluate what works, and what works here in Glasgow, maybe elsewhere in Dundee, in Aberdeen, or in the rural spaces, and really listen to each other, because every single sector, every single discipline has got something to bring in to kind of build the digital infrastructure. So there's a wee QR code up there, plugging something we're trying to do at the moment, which is bringing people together and connecting in order to discuss those opportunities further.
Great. Thanks, Emilie. Go for it.
Hi everyone, I'm Bryce Cunningham. If you've seen me on Facebook, you might have known me as Farmer Bryce. I'm a dairy farmer down in Mossgiel in Ayrshire. I'm also the director of Mossgiel Farm, and together with 31 of the Mossgiel herd, we deliver fresh organic milk across Scotland in a single-use plastic-free way, and as I'm going to go into later on, in quite a unique way as well. Something you don't know about me, when I left school at 16, I hated farming. I actually said to my father, I'm not going to stand underneath the arse of a cow the rest of my life. And went to work at Mercedes-Benz, and it became full look back to this.
Hello, I'm
Emilie.
Emilie Seward. So I work for IGS, which is a vertical farming technology provider. And I thought I'd take 2 seconds to just explain briefly what vertical farming is, so everyone's on the same page. The idea is you have open field, so your normal arable fields of land. You've had the technology advance to sort of sometimes go to a semi-controlled environment, so that would be a glass house where you take that production, you bring it in, and you're protecting it with glass, but you're still exposed to variations in temperature and light because it's glass and it's not fully enclosed. The next step that's been taken towards total controlled environment agriculture is trying to control all of that environment. So the sunlight is replaced with LED lights, the rain is replaced with irrigation, the nutrients is a fertilizer mix, and you're also controlling your environment. And that's why it's really exciting to be here today, because as you can imagine, if you're trying to control that whole environment, you need loads of sensors, loads of information, loads of feedback loops to be able to do that properly and grow high quality crops. The rest of the stuff is more just slightly interesting. I'm not going to go into it. My fun fact is as part of my PhD, I discovered a new species of parasite that my then partner wanted me to name after him, and I thought that wasn't a good basis for a relationship. So I didn't, and he's now my husband. So.
Naming your ex-partner after a parasite must be a great...
I can't top that.
Last but not least.
Good afternoon. I work for SOCI, South of Scotland Enterprise, and we're the newest economic and community development agency in the south in Scotland. And we have 2 aims. One is to promote and support the economic and social development of the south of Scotland, and the other is to protect and enhance the environment. So we're looking through a sustainable development lens to address the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. Agriculture is a massive issue in the south of Scotland. We have 1/5 of the land mass, and it has really shaped us economically, environmentally, and socially, culturally. So we need to address that. What I think is missing in this whole thing is that connecting people back to the land. We've lost that connection. So I guess my ask to the audience is how we can use technology to reconnect people to the soil, to how we produce our land and how we develop and use food. Bit about me, I keep rare breed sheep. So I have very feisty and independent Castle Milk Morits and some very cute but cunning Shetlands. And I take their fleeces and turn them through a wet felting process into vessels, which is about as low-tech as you can possibly get.
Thanks, Jayne. So we've kind of organised this session around the concept of reconnection, coming back to the point that was made previously about the need to reconnect systems and figure out how we can find synergistic solutions that link the demand and supply side of the food system that generate environmental and human health outcomes. So we're going to carry you through that narrative in 4 short 3-minute kind of sprints, starting with Bryce. And Bryce, I'm going to ask you to comment a little bit about the concept of how you think about your agricultural system in terms of its connection and, if you like, reconnection with the natural processes. The UN in almost every COP summit starts with the statement that we need to make peace with nature, that the economy is not above nature, it's of nature. We're not in control, we need to participate. What does that actually mean in real life, given that the farming community they're the people that manage our rural landscapes?
Well, John, we were talking last week in my Zoom call, and I said I'd like to start us off with a Burns quote. So you'll notice from the branding at Mossgiel Farm, we've got Robert Burns, and that's because Robert Burns used to farm at Mossgiel. And the quote I'd like to start off with is, "I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union." At the time, in 1785, Rabbi Burns had just overturned a mouse's nest, and he had a realisation that man, or humankind, had an impact on the natural environment. In his case, it was a mouse to the plough. 250 years later, we're seeing massive biodiversity loss and climate change. So, as Rabbi had first envisioned, farmers have an impact on the environment that we all live in today. A couple of hundred years later, I'm now the head of the farming business. The reason I'm the head of the farming business is because my father and grandfather both died from terminal conditions as partners in the business at the time. When they died, the bank foreclosed on us, and the milk market price internationally had collapsed. So we were left with a business that I had no experience running. We had no money behind us, and we had a market selling into that we had no power over. I felt that was a great shame, because we had decades and centuries of farming in Mossgiel and was about to be over. However, I started thinking, how do we turn this around? How do we start creating a business which is sustainable, not just from a financial and an economic point of view, but also from an environmental point of view? I started looking into the history of Mossgiel, how we'd farmed it 100 and 200 years ago. I started looking at different ways of farming. So that was organic, pasture for life-based farming, and pastoral farming around the world. And we now, because of the issues we had to sell all of the family's cows, we were left with just 28 cows out of 150. We went from a system which was very high input farming, using a lot of cereals to feed cows, to get a lot of milk out of those cows, to a system where we couldn't afford to buy the feed for the cows, we couldn't afford the fertiliser for the land, and the cows were producing as much milk as the grass would give them that we could grow in the summer months. So it sort of really made me realise the power of nature. The nature was growing grass. We had Ayrshire cows native to the area, and they were producing a lot less milk than they were, but they were still producing milk. And all we had to do was change the system to rethink how we did that. Now, of course, 28 cows means not very much milk, which also meant that the big companies didn't want to work with us, and we had to sell direct. So we started pasteurising our own milk. We became organic because, again, we couldn't afford the fertiliser and the fancy feed, and we started selling to a local community. And it was at that point I realised that change really had to happen. I now had a direct relationship with the end consumer, and the end consumer was asking more and more about farming practices. It was at that time the animal rights movement started asking questions about cows. They started asking questions about farming, and it started asking questions about how agriculture was impacting the environment. And I realised locally that other farms had also been impacted by this milk price collapse, and they had also become organic and started using low input systems. So we approached them and we said, look, could we try and revitalise a 100-year-old farming system whereby we use what we grow on the farm to feed the cows, we then pasteurise that milk, we sell to our local communities. Thankfully for us, this was about 2017, and it was very well received across Ayrshire, now up into Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen and Inverness, and we've grown our business. And it's allowed us to be in a position where we can now work with other farmers in a cooperative way to start supplying milk direct from the grass to the glass of the end consumer. And wider, as we start looking at the whole business, we stopped using single-use plastic because, again, we felt it had a massive impact on our environment. We're trying to decarbonise Mossgiel. We've actually put a massive pledge out there to be carbon neutral by 2025 as a small business. And we're utilising current technology like biomass, solar panels and electric vehicles to try and do that. Recently, we were recognised by East Ayrshire Council and were able to win a supply to supply all the schools in East Ayrshire, and then ultimately all the early learning centres and all the leisure centres and sort of other assisted living places as well. And it was the first of its kind in Scotland, where we had zero waste, 100% organic milk from local suppliers, and also delivered with no transport emissions through electric vehicles. So we truly believe that this system is scalable, and that's what we're trying to do at Mossgiel just now, to build a new dairy in a net zero way, to widen out this whole sort of relationship between farm and consumer. I'm going to stop talking now, but I'm going to leave you with another Burns quote, and that Burns quote is, "Give me a spark, a nature's fire, that's all the learning I desire." Again, 250 years ago, that single person working the farm that I now work today was able to have the foresight that organic farmers and people today need to keep one eye on nature and learn from it.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. and thanks for sticking to time as well. Emilie, I wanted to talk to you about vertical farming has been in the news a lot. Sometimes it's thought as being somehow a replacement for broadacre farming, which I know you don't think it is, but what it does do is bring farming into the city, in principle at least. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of technology in vertical agriculture and its role in connecting environmental and human health?
Yeah, sure. So I think first I'll address that point about replacing traditional agriculture. There's no way, well, I don't think that we're going to see an apple orchard being put into these vertical farms anytime in the future. There's a lot of crops that it makes sense to grow in these vertical towers where you stack the crop up and you have a lot of saving of the space, but there's a lot of crops where that just is not going to be the most economic thing to do. So absolutely, we do not see this as replacing traditional agriculture. We see it as a tool for the growers, for the people in food production to give them something new to work with and something that will hopefully help them. So the interesting point you made there is it sort of brings agriculture more into an urban setting. You're absolutely right. So because these towers are very space economic, you can bring them right into the city centre. You can have your food production right there. But I think there's also still that lovely link back to more traditional agriculture where you can use them outside in a rural, not outside, out of the city in a rural environment, and you can use it as the starter crops for your glasshouse or for your outdoor agriculture. So we see it very much as augmenting the existing system and being a useful tool. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the role of technology in this. So IGS is, as I said, using a lot of sensors to do this, and this year's been really exciting for us because we've started to build out our team here in Glasgow. So quick shout out to Ian White and the other platform team. So we've got a new Glasgow office, and their sole focus is looking at which sensors we want to bring in to augment our understanding of what's going on. And like the previous talk was talking about, sort of closing that loop between sensor, information, action, and then data-driven decision-making. So it's a really exciting time for us, really excited that they're here as well. The other very brief thing I wanted to talk on, just to sort of segue to the next talk, is some of the sensors which we don't have yet and which would be really exciting. So one of the exciting things about vertical farming is you have this very fine control over the way the crop grows. I don't know how many of you are plant scientists, but plants are incredibly adaptive, and changing the light or the temperature or even the density that they grow at can have huge impacts on the morphology, the shape of the crop as it grows, the nutritional content, and all of those other things. So you can imagine a world in which we have sensors that will help us track that live. So you can gather that data at sort of the end of the cycle at the moment, but if you imagine like live sensors being able to track that, I see it as a really exciting tool for boosting nutrition quality in crops, helping pack more into a smaller volume so that you only have to eat one Brussels sprout and hopefully not a whole plate of them. So that was all I wanted to touch on today, but I'm really excited to be here.
That's great. Thanks a lot, and I think there'll be a lot to pick up on that. And it does segue nicely into Emilie too, who is started off in plant science, as we heard, but is now working in nutrition. And can you tell us a little bit about how, what that connection is between the way food is produced and its nutrition, and how we could, how healthier diets might actually be beneficial for the environment in return?
I think that's a big question, a big compound question, but
it's only 3 minutes you've got.
Yeah, as well. I think the way things are produced definitely impact on the nutritional quality, and that's something that consumers don't always see. You buy something in a supermarket, not necessarily aware about its kind of micronutrient level. You might see what's on the packet, but that's not what's in the product. And it becomes an equity issue, because often the most affordable products are not the most nutritionally adequate, I would say. Ultimately, going back to the soil and how things are produced really has the potential to improve the quality of the food that we eat and the food that we can afford. At the moment in Scotland, we know that there's a massive health inequality. there's a massive inequality in terms of the type and the quality of the food that people can afford. And to really transform the Scottish food system, we need to find those innovations, going back to the soil quality, production method, but we also need to think about the consumer and changing the demand, thinking about accessibility, availability, and acceptability of what we're offering, and building up trust, because without trust, there's no demand for those new solutions, and there's no improvement in health. And defining health success, it could be anything. We know that we've got a challenge with overweight, obesity, certainly in Scotland, but we also have challenges with food poverty and malnutrition, and those are totally different, but they have common roots in deprivation. So thinking about how innovation and creating a different diet can be a kind of vector to support equity in health is really important, I think.
Great, thanks. And of course, the potential of technology to make it easy for people to make the right choices as well. It's really important. One of the best quotes from COP26 in Glasgow for me was blah, blah, blah. Greta Thunberg, always criticizing that we're talking and not doing. So we wanted to finish with Jayne, who's going to tell us how we can take a lot of these ideas and a lot of the presentations and things that came earlier in the day and actually implement them into action on the ground, because there is an urgent need to do that at scale. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how your role and the South of Scotland Enterprise might be planning to do exactly that.
Yeah. Well, this is obviously at the moment an incredibly dynamic policy arena. There's a lot going on around agricultural reform, land reform, biodiversity, community wealth building. So it's very hard to understand at the moment where the policy direction is going. But we are delivering some specific projects within South of Scotland to try and explore some of the issues that have been discussed so far. I just wanted to give you a flavour of those. We need to understand not just the quantity of the natural capital assets we have, but the quality, and that's where it gets difficult to do. So we need to find a really simple, robust method that we can repeat, so that when we can see changes, we can then change our policy to make sure those changes don't get worse. So on that particular area, we've been working with Space Intelligence. We're a really innovative company to see how we might use satellite data and then LiDAR data to explore how we can have an understanding of that change over time. Through CENSIS Tech, and also sponsored and supported by CENSIS, which we're very grateful, we did a challenge we put out to help us understand how land managers could get the most benefit from their land use decision-making processes. So how they could get the most carbon benefit and increase the biodiversity. And in here we're working with a really exciting and innovative tech company, Rethink Carbon. And they're looking at how you can make land use decision-making a lot simpler and a lot quicker by crunching some of that data and also making it more democratic. So it means stakeholders and communities are right at the centre of this decision-making process because they can see data in real time, they can input data and they can influence it. And then that allows them to influence the policymakers and change those land use decisions. In the south of Scotland as well, we're one of 5 regional land use partnership pilots. And that's exploring how we make decisions as to how we allocate land. We only have a finite amount of land. We have a lot of conflicting uses of that. And as I said at the beginning, for the south of Scotland in particular, food production is really key to this. So we need to make sure we allocate the right use of land in the right location. And we need lots of data to understand that and to explore that. And we do decision-making tools to help us make those right decisions. We're really lucky in the south of Scotland. We have the first biosphere. We have the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire biosphere. And they're looking at how you work with businesses and communities to have a living, working countryside. Because this is not a static thing. It has to make sense economically. And it's key connection for our cultural heritage, our tourism, and the food production side. We're also part of a Borderlands growth deal, which will be coming online, hopefully in the spring next year, where we've got a range of projects, one specifically on data, so there's lots of opportunities to engage through that. But on the food production side, we're doing a project on whole farm audits. So rather than have lots of different advisors going into a farm, we can package it together so that farm is economically viable, because it needs to be that for our cultural and economic resilience. It needs to protect our biodiversity. It needs to store carbon, because the soil, the capacity to store carbon in soil, I think is kind of missed a bit. You know, farmers are often seen as the enemies of this process and having a detrimental impact on climate change. We need to address that. And we need to produce safe food that can be supplied in a low carbon way to our communities across Scotland. And then we're also hoping to work with John next year on a regenerative agriculture process. So we get to explore what people actually want from their farms and from the farming community, how they make that reconnection, as I explained, as talked about at the beginning, to food production methods. And I just wanted to tell you the quote, that's why I've got the cards. Wangari Maathai is one of my heroes. She was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, amazing Kenyan. And she said, "You cannot protect the environment unless you empower people. You inform them, and you help them understand that those resources are their own, and they must protect them." And it's that's the missing link, I think. We need to really embed that into all our activity in this field.
Brilliant.
Thanks, John.
Thanks a lot, Jayne. Round of applause. So you're all part of this because you all eat, and that's reflected in the myriad of questions that we're getting on Slido. So keep them coming in, because we've left 10 minutes for discussion. How cool is that? Well done to the speakers for keeping to time. Ross McLean, if you could put your name on it, it doesn't matter, because I'd like the people to ask the question to stick their hand up, because I want to know if the answer actually answers the question they want. You might want to ask a bit more. Ross McLean asks, Bryce, this is for you, I think. What do you see as the next steps in developing the connected farm?
So the connected farm can bring on various different meanings. So, for example, if not everyone will know, but dairy farming isn't just dairy farming. It can be high intensity, low intensity. The cows can be outside grazing. Cows can be in a shed having grass brought to them and various foods brought to them. So it means different things for different farms. Connected farms are a really interesting thing. So from my experience, what we're trying to do in my own farm is we want to measure various different things, from milk quality, cow health, soil health, the emissions that we're producing as a farm and as a processing dairy as well. And from the processing dairy, who also speaks directly to the consumers, we want a relationship from the consumer to the farm. Now, one of the projects we are working on in the background is trying to figure out a way to be able to know, have a system, whereby a customer can visit a shop where it either has a vending machine or it has a bottle with a QR code on it, and they either can use a screen or some kind of connected device to know exactly where that bottle of milk came from. Now, we actually have all that technology just now, but as it was mentioned earlier, we're just not connecting it all together. So everything exists to do it, and I believe that that's going to be a main driver in the future, so that people can walk into a shop and go, right, I want milk from this particular brand, and I can meet this particular farmer, this is a family, this is the cows it came from, this is the system it came from, and we can start to see real change happening at farm level, and fairness from glass to grass as well.
Great. That answer your question? Yes, good. One for Emilie, about the fact that as more plant-based, what we call plant-based, which we just used to call plants, food, and I guess they're also thinking about lab-produced meat. Does it require different technology for nutrient, or different ways of looking at nutrient profiling?
I mean, nutrient profiling can be very crude, from basic data sets that you find on labels to kind of more complex kind of analysis of the food itself in the lab. Ultimately, it depends on what nutrient matters. You can do nutrient profiling based on just your carbohydrate, your protein, and your fats, and you can classify things. Profiling is just dichotomizing food into a kind of better, good, and not so good categories. It's not necessarily helpful to think about food in that good and bad kind of way, but often is what nutrient profiling ends up doing. I think it becomes really interesting when it's enabling kind of distribution decisions on making sure that that quality is there for consumer across the kind of affordability spectrum, and that no one is left with only an option to purchase lower quality foods because that's what's available to them.
Yeah. Good enough answer, whoever asked that question? I'm guessing so. Vertical farming, so there's a question here about how can we get rid of pesticides in food production? And I know that there's a lot talked about, getting rid of chemicals in agriculture, which is interesting because plants are full of chemicals. But anyway, I think what people mean is artificial chemicals. The trade-off being, of course, that if we don't produce more food per unit acre, we need more land, and we're already using up far too much compared to the rest of biodiversity, which is crashing as a result. So there's a trade-off between managing the inputs whilst maximizing, getting more from less, basically. But vertical farming is an interesting example, isn't it, of how a different way of managing pests and diseases. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So it is a really exciting tool. So one of the big chemicals that are sprayed on fields are herbicides to control weeds, whereas what you have in a vertical farm is you're only seeding the seeds you want. You can use an inert or a sterilized substrate, and you don't have any problems with weeds, and therefore you have no need for a herbicide. So you can completely remove that from your plant production. The other big one is spraying for pests. So again, depending on what it is, because you're growing from seed in a controlled environment normally, you can manage your pest levels very easily. Often they're negligible. So in our crop research center in Dundee, we, as far as I'm aware, have never sprayed with a chemical pesticide on our crops. Occasionally we'll use integrated pest management, which is effectively using other insects to control a population and just turn it into more of an ecosystem. But yeah, there's no need to spray the crops, and again, you're removing that from the system. And the final cool one is, because we recirculate the water, any fertilizer that you're putting in there, if it's not used the first time round, it gets sterilized again, and then it goes around a second time. So you've got no trouble with fertilizer runoff going into rivers, eutrophication, any of that. So in terms of improving the chemical use in food production, I think it's quite a good tool.
Thank you. And this is probably going to have to be the last question, unfortunately, because we're going to run out of time. But I think we're going to be around if you want to catch us later. And this is to Jayne, and you made this point that Scotland is recognised for its clean environment, wildness, amazing quality of food, but the regular Scottish diet doesn't necessarily, or at least, doesn't reflect that. How can it be easier to eat more local?
It's about shortening supply chains. I think that's the key thing. And there's a big issue around procurement. I mean, it's really interesting what you were saying, Bryce. East Ayrshire has been really innovative in pushing the boundaries on procurement, and it builds in what I mentioned before, was community wealth building. There is something here about, it's about access, isn't it, to good quality local food. And if you haven't got that, it may not just be money, it may just be location. So we just need to think about connecting people, shortening supply chains so people can find out exactly where their food's coming from. But the actual diet itself, I think, is a real complicated issue because people have very complicated relationships with food. And you could give people the best quality food, the most healthy food for them, and they're still not necessarily going to eat it. So, there are other issues to address when it comes to actually getting that diet improved.
And the potential of technology also to connect demand and supply side at a smaller scale could make it a lot easier to enable that. We have to stop now. There are lots of other questions to answer, but I think we'd be happy to take these over coffee or after the networking event. I would just like to thank the 4 speakers for giving up their afternoon to come along and open a dialogue with this community. And because I strongly believe that the answer to delivering impact at scale is out there, and it's not just something that would be nice to do or a nice business case. There is an imperative both from a health point of view and from the future of the environment point of view, which we're seeing play out as we speak globally. So one maybe last round of applause to thank the speakers for their time.